and we start with the Fantasist archetype. The Fantasist archetype is the part of you that imagines the things that you desire. The Fantasist within you desires pleasure, indulgence, and reverie. The Fantasist archetype lives by a motto: arouse me and I'm yours. And so the Fantasist archetype is our super highway drive towards experiences that are stimulating and satisfying. We are triggered by and launched towards anything or anyone that gives the thrill, excitement, the pleasure, and the decadence. You are being the fantasist when you are having vivid imaginations coupled to strong yearnings for something that you have imagined will bring you ultimate pleasure. Where you are lost within a pleasurable fantasy, your mind is in fantasy mode. And typically, you start to fantasize when actual reality has become dissatisfying. When you feel unhappy, when things are boring, uneventful, unappealing, and discomforting, this is when you start to fantasize about a more exciting and abundant life. And so, a fantasy is a way of escaping reality. And to help you recognize when the fantasist archetype is present within you as a state of being and doing, I have categorized 5 different types of fantasies. So let's first explore fantasy ideals. Okay, so we all fantasize about living the most ideal type of life. We idealize living the most perfect, most suitable, most effective, most luxurious, most satisfying, most secure, and most comfortable version of reality. We can fantasize about the ideal relationship, ideal career, ideal finances, ideal home, ideal appearance, ideal possessions, ideal experiences. I think you get the picture. Now, ideals are important to have. Aiming for higher standards is what gives us a target to strive for. And having an ideal to achieve is what elicits the motivation to become, do, and have better. Desiring better ideals is what bolsters the creativity, the initiative, and the drive to take action to manifest its tangible result. And besides, the best life journey is one that transitions upwards from the unideal to the ideal circumstances and experiences. The best aim in life is to get better and become more refined over time, and having ideals is the ideal way to do that. And when doing the actual work to manifest an ideal, we have the peace of mind today that we are taking action and making changes to arrive at a better place tomorrow. Therefore, fantasizing about ideals whilst implementing the plans to achieve them is a positive thing. However, most people fantasize about ideals but never take the action to manifest them. They suffer the juxtaposition of yearning for the ideal relationship, yearning for the ideal home, the ideal lifestyle, and yet without the appropriate actions, they are left feeling disappointed with an actual reality that is far from the ideals that they fantasize about. Now let's move on to the subject of sexual fantasies. Everybody fantasizes about sex. Sex is the principal drive and the cardinal desire of the human experience. We all have sexual drives and needs that we would like satisfied because sex feels good. Sex is good for one's psychological welfare. And our desires to have sex are always accompanied with a sexual fantasy. During a sexual fantasy, we imagine the ultimate scenario of having sex, and that vivid imagery arouses the intense desire to have sex or to self-pleasure with masturbation. Now, during a sexual fantasy, we get turned on and enjoy the stimulation of excitement and euphoria. Having sexual fantasies is a healthy sign that you are interested in some form of intimacy and sensuality with someone. And when you share a sexual fantasy with a trusted partner, this can actually strengthen the bond of that existing relationship. When single, sexual fantasies are the preluding desires, the urge and inclination to approach people that we are sexually attracted to. When single, on a primal level, we do go out and meet people on the premise that it will lead to casual dating and sex, or that we will find a lifelong sexual partner. Either way, a sexual fantasy is the driving factor to find a sexual partner. So think of sexual fantasies as being these mind rehearsals that prime you mentally and emotionally to seek out intimate relationships. Sexual fantasies can, however, be dark and sordid. Many people will fantasize about having dirty sex, orgy sex, swapping partner sex, rough sex, violent sex, taboo sex, like having sex in public places or being watched whilst having sex or watching others have sex. And some people will even fantasize that their partner will cheat on them. Dark and sordid sexual fantasies can, however, make someone feel immoral, shameful, inappropriate, and wrong. And if acted out in real life, dark and sordid sexual fantasies can take you down the pathway of depravity, perversion, and degradation, which is to defile the mind, body, and soul, where the human body has become nothing more than a sexual instrument that yearns for gratification. There is no love or deeper connection during a sordid act of sex. There is just a lustful desire to have your wicked way and get the pleasure that you crave. And when introducing sordid fantasies into a relationship on the premise of trying something different or trying to spice things up, then this could desecrate the sacred, sensual, and respectful act of two people making love with each other. People in relationships can also have sexual fantasies about other people. This could be that you imagine having sex with the next door neighbor, a work colleague, a friend, or even a pornographic actor that you are watching on a screen. Although it may seem harmless, innocent, and nothing to be concerned about when fantasizing about having sex with someone else, you are still being unfaithful to the person that you are having a relationship with, because going there mentally and emotionally is still an experience. Also, sexual fantasies can be especially detrimental for men because they can lead to excessive masturbation and porno addiction. Excessive masturbation and addiction to porno conditions the mind and body with that activity as the go-to place to get your sexual stimulation and relief. If you are in a relationship with someone, over masturbation and porno addiction can lead to a loss of attraction, a loss of interest in sex and intimacy with the other person. And if you are watching professional sex workers engage with explicit sex acts on the digital screen, then you are likely to form a lopsided and disproportionate viewpoint towards the act of sex. And if these viewpoints are not reciprocated by a partner, this can lead to doubts, distrust, and paranoia in the relationship, conflict and resentment when you start expressing those lopsided viewpoints. If you are single, then excessive masturbation and porno addiction will lead to a loss of interest and motivation to pursue sexual encounters in real life, because if you are getting your sexual needs relieved over here, then there is no need to find a partner to get your sexual needs satisfied over there, which in effect takes one further away from the very thing that they truly desire: sex with a real person. Sexual fantasies can also upset the dynamics of a relationship when two people have different sex drives. If those sexual drives are not acknowledged, explored, appreciated, and resolved, then this can lead to sexual incompatibility and frustrations between two people. Also, fantasizing a lot about sex is the cause of flirtatious, provocative, seductive, and promiscuous behavior. Being a highly sexualized person is not a bad thing when it has constraint, discernment, taste, and style with it. However, being a highly sexualized person when expressed loosely, carefree, and with lurid behaviors will, however, attract bad attention and possibly negative treatment from others, where being promiscuous comes with the risk of gaining a bad reputation, alienation, and disapproval amongst peers, and where you will only attract people who are solely interested in sex with you. And so, to conclude this part about sexual fantasies, your sexual fantasies are attached to the memories, emotions, desires, and drives that you have for sexual encounters. They affect your sexual appetite and sexual proclivity. They are powerful imaginations that trigger and sexualize you. Now, let's explore pleasure-based fantasies. Let me start by saying that all fantasies are pleasure-based, and in terms of defining a pleasure-based fantasy, I am talking about the fantasies that we have for sugary and fatty comfort foods, the fantasies about enjoying the pain-soothing and pleasure-giving effects of alcoholic beverages, illicit and prescriptive drugs, and the rewarding activities of gambling, gaming, and social media. And of course, pleasurable activities are a part of life. A little bit of pleasurable indulgence every once in a while and within strict moderation is harmless. In fact, it is essential to living a balanced life, and because you've only got one life, why not enjoy a little bit of pleasure now and then? However, pleasure does beget pleasure. We have some stimulating pleasure and it feels good, so we immediately want more, whereby moderation soon becomes compulsion, and compulsion soon becomes addiction, where we can't stop the habit even if we wanted to. That said, pleasure-based fantasies can be utilized in a positive way when the anticipation of a future reward is a positive compensation for the efforts that we apply today in achieving a task. To get through the work, the hardships, and the repetitions of everyday life, we sometimes do need to know that there is some type of pleasurable reward at the end of it that makes the effort worthwhile. However, pleasure-based fantasies can lead to overindulgence. Overindulgence with pleasure and rewarding yourself for nothing leads to complacency, whereby you become oversatisfied, content, and lazy even. And because a pleasurable fantasy can be so strong, one can develop this reactive and ravenous lust for pleasure that overrides logic and rationality, where even if you wanted to give up a bad habit like quit the booze or quit the junk food, the powerful drives and desires of that fantasy are so strong that the fantasy itself will sabotage those newfound intentions that you have to improve your diet. In other words, you can relapse and go back to your old ways when triggered by a pleasurable fantasy. Moving on, let's now explore the subject of speculative fantasies. What are speculative fantasies? With a speculative fantasy, we are imagining that things will be somehow better in the future and without any evidence that they will be. So why do we fantasize that things will get better in the future? We do so to find some meaning and hope. We speculate that things will get better so that we have a reason to endure the difficult circumstances that we find ourselves in today. We also speculate with fantasy that things will be better in the future because it fuels the motivation to move towards a preferred ideal. Now, speculative fantasies can help us to get through adverse circumstances when going through times which are painful, disappointing, or depressive even. When imagining that things will somehow change and improve, we get a sense of alleviating hope. However, speculative fantasies are delusional because they have no basis in actual reality. And although they can provide a hope that things will get better in the future, it is still a false hope. Also, imagining that a bad scenario today will somehow get better in the future can lead us to then rationalize why we should continue putting up with that bad scenario today. So for example, someone could be suffering some type of verbal or physical abuse from someone they know, and because they fantasize that the abuser will stop soon and change their ways in the future, they continue to put up with that abuse today. We can also see someone that we desire behaving badly with someone else and fantasize that they will somehow be different with us. We can also see someone that we admire achieving something that we desire and then buy into an imagined fantasy that we can do the exact same as them, when in reality we can't. When fooling ourselves with a fantasy that something or someone will be better in the future, this can lead to a sense of disappointment and failure even when that fantasy does not arrive, or does arrive but not as we expected. Then we have the non-reality fantasies. The fantasist within you is deeply involved within the mental stimulations of virtual reality. This would include the virtual productions of cartoon animations, sci-fi, CGI films and documentaries, computer games and social media apps. And if virtual reality has become a prominent theme in your life, then this experience is feeding the fantasist's imagination within you. Now, virtual reality obviously does have a benefit in this world when, for example, when we are using the virtual reality of computers to design and visualize creations and inventions that have a creative value and purpose in the real world. Expressing our wildest imaginations will help us to push the boundaries of what is known and possible. With far-fetched fantasies, we can make the impossible become possible. We can make the unreal real. Some of the greatest inventions in life have begun as fictional and fantastical ideas inside the mind that first seemed impossible to create. However, instead of using the virtual reality as a means to be productive, the virtual reality is using people as a means of monetization, entertainment, and distraction. Huge swaths of people get sucked into their digital screen only to waste valuable time consuming information and images and buying digitized products that have no practical use and that gets no tangible results in the real world. where virtual reality has taken over the real experience of actual reality. People can also get caught up within a non-reality based fantasy whereby one has constructed this imaginary world inside one's head that has no foundation, no function, and no use within the real world. If you spend more time living inside the head or glued to a computer screen than you do cultivating a balanced and rewarding life in actual reality, then your life will be a very sheltered, limited, and unadventurous experience, whereby the portrayals of an exciting life are flashing across your digital screen can make actual reality look quite dull, uneventful, and in some cases intolerable in comparison. And so many people have this fantasy escapism and digital entrapment paradigm, where they get stimulating relief from the hardships and mundaneness of actual reality by losing themselves inside the stimulation of digital reality, whereby the digital trance has become a lifestyle trap. When pacifying your fantasies with a digital reality, you are trading the creative potential of your organic imagination for the pre-recorded imagery of other people's imaginations. Rather than explore, exalt, and express your own imagination, you become a participant of other people's imaginations that are being projected out and into your mind from the digital device. There is also the high risk of developing a digital psychosis, a mental disorder where the mind has been hijacked by a virtual world of images, and the mind itself is being impaired and disconnected from actual reality, where there is less correlation and compatibility between the virtual and actual realities, and therefore less interest and inclination to participate in a real world that does not meet the interests, expectations, and stimulations of your digital reality. And so, with a keen eye for that which stimulates imagination, the fantasist within you is likely to become a slave to the virtual illusions of a digital world. Now let's move on to a summary of the detriments of the fantasist archetype. Fantasies are delusional until proven in actual reality, and there's nothing wrong with imagining something to be better in the future, as long as we do realize that until we take remedial action to manifest that reality, we are holding onto a fantasy of false hope. Fundamentally and ultimately, until proven in the real world, all fantasies are delusional imaginations. Delusional in that we have constructed an imagined scenario inside the mind where we fantasize over a fictional reality inside the mind that has not happened yet, that might not happen, that perhaps could not happen in the real world. Until what we have imagined does take place out there in the real world, the fantasy is nothing more than a delusion, a figment of the imagination, an unverified belief, a false impression, where the fantasy has minimal to zero foundations in the facts of reality. So what does this actually mean, and what are the implications of ruminating with delusional fantasies? Well, we need to realize that they are not real, that we should not get too involved, should not grow too attached, should not get too wrapped up inside the head with a fantasy. Why? Because otherwise we can end up living with this psychological lifestyle paradox whereby we have these fantasies inside the mind that are completely unfounded, absurd, and contradictory to the actual reality of our life. Furthermore, if you spend more time inside your head nurturing a fantasy than you do actualizing the skills and activities required to cultivate the actual life that you desire and fantasize about, then you are living a life with a delusional perspective. And this paradox, this juxtapose, can be met with frustration, disappointment, and suffering if what we fantasize about and desire does not match the way that we live. We also imagine the upside without the downside. One of the major downfalls of the fantasist archetype is to fantasize about the end result of what we desire, what we idealize, without taking into account the actions required to achieve that result. And for that reason, what we fantasize about, those scenarios that we imagine just as we would prefer them to be in their finished state, that final fantasy, when compared to the circumstances that we face in actual reality, that fantasy can seem totally unrealistic to achieve, where the image of what we desire appears way too distant, way different, way too improbable and too undoable. When comparing the upside of the final fantasy with the situations that we are in right now, we can start to think that the situation today is impossible, that it is not good enough, not fair, and that we might believe that we don't have the skills, the resources, and circumstantial fortune to manifest that fantasy. And thus, that final fantasy that we hold up on the pedestal can seem so unrealistic that it actually makes us feel demotivated, demoralized, and depressed even that we can't achieve it, where we never take action because it seems pointless. Also, the fantasist archetype does romanticize about the upside of an ideal with little consideration for its downside. This means that we can fall into a delusional trap of fantasizing over the perfect ideal, whereby we think of all the positives, all of the good things that will happen once we get the ideal result, without taking into consideration the negative aspects of the ideal that we fantasize over. And believe me, they do exist. So the trap that we fall into inside the mind when imagining, say, the ideal career, the ideal relationship, or the ideal finances, etc., is to conjure up these unrealistic, once in a lifetime, these happily ever after fairy tale scenarios whereby we imagine the final fantasy of how great that ideal will be without taking into account the efforts, the difficulties, the unknowns, the sacrifices, and the costs that are required to manifest that ideal and then live out the ideal circumstances that we fantasize about. And it is when you chase after imagined ideals without the proper due diligence that the fantasist trait will set you up for an almighty fall. Because when you are totally enthralled by the positives of the outcome that you desire, you are also blinded to its negatives, whereby there are unforeseen obstacles, complications, and problems along the way, which then become these painful experiences, these mistakes, losses, and failures. You see, every time that you act upon a fantasized ideal without considering its downside counterpart, you embark on an ill-conceived ideal that, ironically, means that you will manifest an unideal situation. Furthermore, when following a lopsided fantasy that does not account for the negatives, you will keep making mistakes in life, perhaps the same mistakes in the same areas of your life. And when you have been pained enough times, you can then start to form negative associations to that part of your life. So for example, if you fantasize about how good a new job or project will be and you never consider the downsides of that job or project, when you take on the work, those unforeseen downsides could be something you have to endure that makes you feel deeply unhappy, which could result in you never being happy at work. You could always be changing from one unhappy job and project to another. The fantasist archetype will also lust over the materialistic ideals of fame and fortune, the glitz and the glory of all the experiences and possessions that boost your ego and provides a sense of status and worth. And yet, when you feed a fantasy that is vain, superficial, and materialistic, What you do and who you become in life will only be a worth that floats on the surface and never resonates deep within to feed the soul of your true nature. Nor will these superficial fantasies provide you with fulfillment and lasting joy. The next detriment of the fantasist archetype is that this characteristic trait is the superhighway trigger to our pleasurable habits and vice. When unchained and unchecked with pleasurable imaginations and desires, the fantasist archetype will become the superhighway trigger towards our naughty, sinful, and indulgent habits. And so, if the compulsions of the fantasy are that strong, it can override your logic, rationality, and composure, where you are so carried away with the desires and urges of your fantasies that you frequently use, abuse, and binge on the things that give you pleasure, especially where stimulating activities and substances are concerned, like junk food, alcohol, illicit prescriptive drugs, gambling, gaming, or social media, and whatever else it is that gives you that little fix, that high, that excitement and thrill. And if pleasure-based activities have taken over your life, if you are addicted to pleasure-based activities where you spend more time pursuing pleasure to the neglect of other parts of your life, like your health, your fitness, your relationships, your finances, then clearly the penchant for pleasure will lead to an imbalanced life. That's because that desire for pleasurable consumption will leave you unfulfilled and impoverished in the other different areas of your life. Being continually driven by the pleasurable desires of a fantasy will only lead to the unrelenting need to pursue and consume more and more pleasure, albeit these are temporary pleasures because pleasure never lasts. And so, temporary pleasure can never provide lasting satisfaction, which is why pleasure begets pleasure. We enjoy the highs, then endure the subsequent lows, and then crave more. And these cravings and highs and lows are all triggering the fantasy of having more pleasure. And when the mind and body is possessed with fantasies of pleasure, one can easily sink into the depraved repetitions of overconsumption and overstimulation, whereby we can cultivate bad and toxic habits that take us downwards on a path of diminishing returns, which means with each cycle of pleasure, the stimulating effect is less, which triggers a need for more and more, which then becomes less and less, where the negative consequences of our bad and toxic habits starts to outweigh and supersede the positives. And those negative consequences can play out psychologically, physically, within our relationships, our finances, and our overall well-being. Which brings us on to the detriment of escaping from actual reality. Almost always, a fantasy is never the same as its manifested reality, which is to say that we can fantasize over the delightful images and desires of the experiences that we long for, and yet in the achievement of that actual experience, the reality of that experience will always look, feel, smell, taste, and sound different than what we had originally fantasized about, where the actual reality of what we desired and achieved can be much nicer or worse than the original fantasy. Quite often, you will find that an imagined fantasy is much better than the actual reality, because the fantasy does not come with the problems, the limitations, the judgments, the upsets, or the disappointments of its manifested counterpart. And so, when the fantasy is better than the actual reality, we can start to incubate with those fantasies inside the mind. And sometimes we can get so lost inside the head with a fantasy that we never pursue it in real life. Because again, the reality is never the same, never as easy, never as secure, never as comfortable, and never as good as the imagined fantasy. The highs of an imagined fantasy will always cause us to frown upon, dismiss, avoid, ignore, and move away from the perceived lows of an actual reality that does not live up to the fantasy. And it is the extreme highs of a fantasy that can cause us to pull back from and never go after a lot of experiences in reality, because we fear that they won't be as good as we expect and desire. Where the fantasy itself has deluded us into believing that we can have the perfect scenario when the perfect scenario does not exist. The fantasy itself can convince us of not settling for anything less or different than the imagined fantasy, even though it is highly unlikely that that imagined fantasy high can be replicated in actual reality. You see, the reality is that actual reality is always messy, uncertain, changing, unfolding, inconsistent, problematic, and where both the highs and lows of life, they exist in equal measure and often exist in the same place. Therefore, pining after or trying to manifest a life that meets the pleasurable demands of a lopsided fantasy will only be met with suffering. We suffer whenever the experiences and achievements that we expect and desire and fantasize about are not forthcoming. And so when the actual reality of our circumstances and environment does not live up to the quality and expectations of the fantasy, we can start to withdraw away from that aspect of our life and withdraw into the fantasy inside the head. We can stop fully engaging with and immersing within the actual reality of that part of our life. If, therefore, the fantasist trait is strong within you, if you are one that fantasizes more often than you actualize those fantasies, then you are likely to get lost within a mental fantasy land, where you are living mainly inside your head as you indulge with the pleasurable images of what you desire. If you are mostly preoccupied with a fantasy world inside the head, then you will spend more time within your imagined fantasies than living within the present moment of reality, the present moment of now, which is the only thing that's real. Because the imagined fantasies inside the head are usually the repetition of images that you have been replaying over and over and over again, which means that you are reliving the recording of an image inside your head, whereas you can only experience actual reality when you are free from the recorded images and thoughts inside your head, when you are in the present moment of now as untainted conscious awareness. Also, if fantasy land is where you spend most of your time, lost inside the head, then your life is going to be pretty static, unadventurous, reclusive, and restricted. You are likely to spend most of your time in a room or continuously plugged into a digital device that is stimulating, feeding, and growing your imagined fantasies, where essentially you are living in a fantasy land prison cell inside your mind. People that spend most of their time within the imagined world of fantasy and that constantly stimulate that fantasy with a digital device will live an enslaved, robotic, and paltry life, where the lifestyle has become one of restricted perimeters and limited adventure and activity. Those who do get snared by mental fantasy land and its counterpart on the digital device will also struggle to cope with the everyday mundaneness of actual reality, whereby the fantasy then becomes the place to get relief from a life that appears to be lackluster, where actual reality does not stimulate the senses as good as the digital stimulus of a virtual reality, where people can start to box themselves off inside a fantasy land and cultivate this private little world inside their head, which is exclusive just to them, and whereby this exclusive little world inside their head is where they start to feel estranged, isolated, and lonely. And so, by feeding your imagined fantasies and living mainly inside their head, although this may provide some type of pleasurable escapism and relief, you are also at risk of cultivating a life that is delusional, disconnected from, and disproportionate to actual reality. And now for the final detriment. Dark fantasies lead to degenerative behaviours. Where dark, sordid, and inappropriate fantasies are concerned, if these fantasies are acted out, then they can lead to experiences and outcomes that degrade and defile the quality of your life, where you are attracting and mixing with the wrong people, ending up in bad places or situations and getting into trouble more often than not. And unless you are a dark soul that has no conscience, then these type of fantasies will elicit the negative emotions of guilt, embarrassment, shame, insecurity, weakness, and even anger. With dark fantasies, you can feel odd, disturbed, and disgusted even by some of the fantasies that you're having. You can start to feel wrong or doubtful about what you are imagining and question your own morality and decency. And so if you have dark fantasies that disturb you, then you may have some unresolved issues in the past that need some type of psychotherapy to resolve. And this is where I will end the profiling of the Fantasist archetype. So, do you resonate with some of the traits that we've discussed? Can you see where this archetype shows up in your life? Do you feel that there are any detrimental aspects of this archetype that are causing you harm? And look, I know that this information is a lot to take in. So it will pay for you to review this webinar presentation until everything does eventually sink in. And it will, I promise you. So let's get ready for the second archetype. The second archetype is the escape artist archetype.